a rich man's world. I have turned the soul of this beautiful land, but that beauty, a rich man's world. I have turned the soul of this beautiful land, but
Hello to everyone out there listening to this episode of Red Lens. My name is Brad Siegel, and I'm the host of Red Lens, a political photography podcast. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with today's guest, Georgia Fort. I first remember meeting Georgia at one of the many protests that have happened outside the governor's mansion in St. Paul. I don't even remember what protest it was exactly, but Georgia was there doing video coverage at that time for Unicorn Riot. Since then, we've run into each other at who knows how many protests and events in the Twin Cities. Georgia's timely and powerful independent journalism has amassed quite an audience, and she's been making a lot of moves the last couple of years. I look forward to talking about some of that today. And Georgia, I know you're busy, so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me for Red Lens about your work documenting and reporting on what's happening in Twin Cities communities and social justice movements. So yeah, let's get into it. Why don't we start with a little bit about you? Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're based, and what you do.
Absolutely, Brad. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I am an independent journalist. As you stated, I have been working in the media industry now for over 10 years. And I started in mainstream media. I started in radio broadcasting. But, more recently here in the Twin Cities area, after not being able to get hired in my hometown, doing what I love to do, doing what I believe I was born to do, I decided that instead of letting that be an end all, be all, instead of allowing some company to determine my future, that I would just do it on my own. And so I started connecting with local nonprofit organizations like SPNN and Unicorn Riot, and quite frankly, just anyone who could help me gather up enough resources to do this work in a sustainable way. Eventually, what I realized was that the most sustainable pathway forward, especially as a mother of three, was to do this work independently and find partner organizations that I could work with in partnership.
So you said you've been in mainstream or corporate media, and you left that. You said because you couldn't find work. Do you want to get into a little bit more about why you think that was the case?
Yeah, well, I'll start with my last job in mainstream media. I was a morning news anchor for the NBC affiliate in Duluth, Minnesota. So I co-anchored the morning newscast with another anchor who actually also produced that newscast. And then I produced the noon newscast and I co-anchored, I produced the noon newscast and solo anchored the noon newscast. So doing that for nearly a year was a dream come true. It was the thing that I had worked my entire career for. Unfortunately, I was not eligible for maternity leave. So when my husband and I had our daughter, who's now 4, going on 5, I didn't get maternity leave. So my contract was terminated legally under federal law, the FMLA, Federal Medical Leave Act. You have to work for a company for at least 12 months to be eligible for maternity leave. And, I was actually oddly optimistic that when that happened, it was my time to come home. I had been working really, really hard to be able to come back to the Twin Cities and do what I love. I had been gone at that point then by, like 5 or 6 years. So I felt really confident that I had enough experience, having been nominated for 2 Emmys, that it was kind of a no-brainer that I would get hired. And oddly, there were positions open at every station. I was also serving as a board member for the Minnesota Society of Professional Journalists. So I had the opportunity to network with a lot of people who were working locally at the time at those stations. So, long story short, I interviewed at every station, but across the board, everybody said that they felt like I needed more experience. And I think our humility, those of us who have it, will take that type of feedback and say, wow, like I really need to grow. I need to work harder. And that's what I did. And so my family, we were preparing to move again. I was actually offered a job in Charlotte, North Carolina. I went to Charlotte, North Carolina. I reported on television in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I loved it. And my family was preparing to move there. But a week after I started my new job, I found out that we were expecting again. And so suddenly it just didn't make sense to leave, right? And have 2 kids and no family. And so I came back, and that was the turning point for me, where I had to get really clear with myself about the pathway, the future that I would have as a storyteller. Because if I was going to be in Minnesota and I couldn't get hired at the 4 companies who hire people to do what I do, then what was I going to do? And it was really defeating. And honestly, when I came back, I felt really hopeless that I was just going to have to, get a job as a teller, or, doing something that wasn't in line with my skill set. And after several months of being really, really depressed, I finally decided, like, you know what? I don't need them to be able to go into my community and tell our stories. And so that's how the journey started, to just, doing this work independently. And I think after George Floyd was murdered, the community realized that there was a greater need for independent media sources, for folks who weren't tied to these corporations, to get out and document what was happening. Because if we solely depend on corporate media, then we will get stories like the one we got the morning after George Floyd was killed, which was that he died of medical complications. And we now know, after the world watched the video filmed by Darnella Frazier, and after Judge Cahill made the determination that George Floyd was murdered, he didn't die from medical complications.
Yeah, so that raises so many issues. One that I wanted to pick up on is, it's just sort of an indictment, I think, of this country overall, but it seems like particularly in the industry that you were in, that a woman or a person who can get pregnant can just lose your job because of that and no other reason. Even if you're nominated for Emmys, you've reported with multiple networks, and it's just not like that in most of the world. Most of the rest of the world has national policies around maternity leave, and it's just sort of shocking to hear, but it's just not shocking because it's the case for so many people in this country.
Yeah, I did a lot of research after that happened, and I did discover what you're talking about, Brad, which is that most countries have 16, 18, weeks of parental leave. So not just for moms, but for both parents. Some countries have a year. Some countries give parents a year off. And when you think about the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, one of those, I believe it's Article 16, states that it is a human right to have a family. Yet and still, our laws on a federal level do not reflect that human right. Now, fast forward, right? We are in a political climate where Roe v. Wade has been overturned. And so what is the real future of women when we live in a country that, will force you to have a child and will fire you for having a child? And so, I felt very vulnerable in that situation because for the first time, my future was not dependent on my work ethic or my education or my skill and ability. My future was determined by my gender, and it felt very discriminatory. I will say, on the other side of that, as a Black woman, as a biracial woman, I felt that there were a lot of other underlying things that were happening that led to that. One being how ironic it is that the last story that I published at that station was a sit down interview with the chief of police, who went on camera for the first time exclusively with me to talk about his family's role in the Duluth lynchings.
Oh,
And
wow.
so the current chief of police, Mike Tuskin, his great aunt was the woman who falsely accused circus workers, Black circus workers, of rape, which incited the triple lynching that happened almost 100 years to the date of when George Floyd was murdered.
That's right.
And so I have no evidence that the things are connected. But boy, is it ironic that 2 weeks after that story aired, I was let go. And whether I was let go because I was unapologetically telling historic stories that were significant to the Black community and timely in a state that was processing the verdict in the case of the officer who killed Philando Castile, that's when that story published. That story published right around the time when the verdict came out for Geronimo Yanez. So this was something we should be talking about, right? So whether I was fired because I was doing those kinds of stories, or whether I was fired because I was having a baby and I wasn't eligible for maternity leave, either way, I found myself in a paradigm that felt very discriminatory.
Absolutely. Yeah. You used the word storyteller when you were talking before, and you've used the phrase changing the narrative, like on your website and in a lot of your communications. So I wanted to maybe get into that a little bit. When people think about journalism, maybe unless you're in journalism, you don't necessarily think about concepts like narrative or story, or think of what you're doing as storytelling. Can you talk about what you mean by changing the narrative? Like, what is a narrative and what needs to be changed?
Yeah, I'll pull from the example I shared earlier about George Floyd. The first narrative that went out was he died of medical complications. That narrative came from the Minneapolis Police Department. They sent out a press release to all the local media outlets, who then published that on their airwaves. That was the narrative. It was not the truth. So when I talk about changing the narrative, and trust me, I've been accused by people who are extremists on either side of the spectrum of changing the truth. And that's not what changing the narrative means. Changing the narrative means identifying when narratives have become popular opinion or have influenced public opinion, and finding the truth, amplifying the truth in order to change the narrative.
So a lot of the corporate media, or basically all of the corporate media for sure here in the Twin Cities, are basically, when it comes to the police, stenographers of whatever the police tell them, and that's something I know you've tweeted and caused some controversy with talking about that, right? Where just questioning, when is the MPD not going to be considered a legitimate source in the city after all the lies that they put out as if they were true and have been later disproven. Yeah, so that brings me to a question about, there's this word activism, right? And when people refer to the journalism that you do, some people call it activism, or say you're sort of like an activist journalist, or talk about you as an activist. And when I've seen that said, you've tended to push back on that. And personally, I see what I do when I photograph protests or write articles reporting on movements. I see that as part of supporting those struggles. And I don't mind if people call me an activist, that's fine. But I found your responses to that to be really interesting in terms of this reality that Black journalists getting labeled as activists just for being Black journalists. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that?
The reality of a Black journalist who also identifies as an activist means that within their industry, within their profession, they potentially could lose credibility or lose access. So I am not okay with my journalism being diminished. And I'm also not okay with taking away from the amazing, powerful, courageous, and brave work that activists are doing every single day. If I self-identify as an activist, will I still be able to get access to the Derek Chauvin trial and the Kimberly Potter trial? That is what is on the line for me as a journalist. Because I have pushed back on that narrative, I have been able to gain access where activists have not been able to gain access. And so I had to learn quickly as I started to blaze this trail of being an independent journalist that I do have to distinguish myself as a journalist, right? And if I do not, then who will fill that role? So if we have everybody going out in the movement and everybody wants to be the person with the bullhorn leading the chants, then who do we have inside the courtroom documenting what is happening there? Because I'll be honest with you, when you watched it, you were only seeing 3 angles. I had a 360-degree view of what was happening. I had a view of what was happening during recess. That is valuable. We need people to fill multiple roles if we are going to see our nation advance in a way that provides equity for everyone. And so I feel like, and I try to pick my words wisely because I'm not trying to say that there is anything wrong with activism. If we are going to see changes and advancement for Black people, if we're going to truly achieve Black liberation, if we are going to evolve as a society, as a nation, so that women are no longer fired when they have babies, it is going to require a successful level of activism.
Mm-hmm.
As a journalist, I feel, however, that my role is exposing truth, exposing injustices, amplifying it, changing the narrative, which are all, I think, things that work together with the collective advancement of our society. I think what we should be concerned about in the Black community or in the activism community is the way in which the word activist has been weaponized against us. In my opinion, I feel like when you're looking at broader society, when you're looking at the perception from people who are not a part of the movement, what does the word activist mean? Does it have a positive or a negative connotation? And what is the criteria to be an activist? Because if every Black person who goes out and talks about injustices is an activist, I mean, the threshold is set very low, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could just be a resident and say, you know what? Like in Mississippi, residents are saying the water is bad. So now they're an activist, so it's like, I think that term is being thrown at every single person who is speaking up about something that is wrong, who is advocating for basic human rights. If you're just advocating, you're saying, hey, our social contract says that these are the things that are promised to us and we're not getting those things. Now you're an activist. Activists, they labor and they sacrifice and they put their freedom on the line. That to me is the true definition of an activist. And so I think that that word has been so loosely used that, yeah, I mean, I want to be able to uplift and amplify our activists. And I also want to maintain my credibility as a journalist. And I don't think that those things are mutually exclusive. So I feel very passionate about that. And my concern is that the same way in the 90s, when people were called thugs just because of how they dressed, I mean, I feel like that is how loosely the word activist is being used, and it's not in a positive way.
Yeah, it's interesting how people who speak out, you mentioned Mississippi, and I was going to ask you about that a little later in the interview, but when people in Jackson, Mississippi without water say, why am I not getting water? That's considered activism. But Supreme Court justices who do very radical things in support of maintaining white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism is not considered activism.
It's a double standard.
It's certainly weaponized against people who even raise questions, let alone try to organize against the status quo that includes many injustices. So yeah, I want to kind of get into going back to what you were talking about, how you started in the sort of mainstream media world and had quite a bit of success in that area. Then when you weren't able to get hired, you started working with Unicorn Riot and some other independent outlets and started building your own social media presence. And then I don't remember exactly when it was, maybe a year or so ago, you launched Black Press. Can you tell us about what that is, who's involved with it, and what does Black Press do?
Black Press was founded in August of 2020. So it's going on 2 years.
2 years, okay.
And it was created because I saw a need for real sustainability for people to be able to do this work. And so I wanted to create an ecosystem and a platform for other independent media makers. Now, in the last 2 years and trying to strategize, how do we do that? What does that look like? Is that what independent media makers need? Those have been the questions that I have asked myself. More importantly, how do we sustain an ecosystem? And so where we are now is we have formalized a newsroom that is composed of young, early career journalists. Right now, they're all women of color who are producing weekly stories that air on local, low-powered FM stations. The news director who is assisting them in producing their stories each week and connecting them with resources is Marianne Combs. And so, not sure if you're familiar with her, but she worked with NPR for more than 2 decades. And she stepped away from her position after they mishandled her story of sexual assault. And so for her as a white woman and as an ally to experience that type of injustice from one of probably the most credible, news outlets in the Twin Cities, her values align with our values, and her mission aligns with our mission. And so it was, a tremendous advancement for Black Press to be able to have her support and partnership in that capacity. Before Marianne came around, we were providing resources, financial resources for people to do the work. We were distributing and amplifying the work that other people were doing. We were able to provide equipment for people, but there was no real ecosystem or structure that was like really put in place to have consistent storytelling done each week. And so we're still a very new organization. We still have a lot to figure out, But I am so excited about our growth and advancement over the last six months, and building on this newsroom of these young journalists who have amazing story ideas that we know, even if they got hired in local newsrooms, the way in which the culture of these newsrooms work would not allow them to pitch some of these stories and actually bring those stories to life. I experienced that. Marianne experienced that. I mean, so many women and women of color have shared those stories. And so, yeah, we're just excited to build on that. And we're hoping to expand and be able to support them in doing some of these stories on camera so that people can visually see and not just hear and read about it. But baby steps, right? We're 2 years old. The newsroom is only a few months old, and we have these huge, ambitious goals. And so we're taking it one day at a time.
That's really inspiring that you've been able to build that in such short time. And I see people filming or reporting for Black Press at a lot of events that I go to. So, there's already a reach that is pretty impressive. And you've been posting recently about a new project, creating a TV show that will air, as I understand it, on one of the major networks, but am I right that it would be independently funded? Tell us about that project, why you're doing it, and how people can support that.
Absolutely. Well, as I have been working to create pathways for other people to have sustainability, I've also been thinking really strategic about what the sustainability of my own independent journalism looks like. And I think there was an assumption that when I launched the newsroom, I would be in a management role and not reporting, and that is not the case. So what does the future of Georgia Fort's independent journalism look like? I think the next level of my work is to bring it back to television. I think when you look at my journey and the way in which, I guess you could say, I was pushed out of television, right? It wasn't because I wasn't good enough, even though that's what people told me. And I know that that's not what it was, because after I did an exclusive interview with Ben Crump, every single station in town circled back and said, hey, maybe you should think about reapplying. And so my journalism does belong on television. Our voices, the voices that I'm amplifying on my social media platform, does belong on television. The truth belongs on television. And so that's what I'm fighting for with this TV show. I think that it expands the reach in which we have. I think it creates a new pathway of sustainability for me as an independent journalist. And it allows us to build a broader team to produce the show with excellence. And for so long, I have gone out with my camera, my tripod, and all of the things, and in the heat, in the freezing cold, in the rain, and all of the situations, you can only produce a certain level of quality for a broadcast when you are what they call a one-man band, or a one-woman band in my case. And I want people to have the experience that they have when they're sitting down on CNN, when they sit down and they talk to me. When they see their interview back, I want them to feel proud of it. And this goes from both extremes, right? Think about all of the families who have sat down with me, who have trusted me to tell their stories. Their loved ones deserve for their story to be told with excellence, all the way to sitting down with Ben Crump or Attorney Blackwell, the lead prosecutor in the Chauvin case, right? This is both spectrums deserve for their stories to be amplified with excellence. And while my work is good and it's gotten me this far, I know that I can take it to the next level when I have a team behind me, a producer, a videographer, an editor, and we can appoint those roles to people who are experts at those roles, right? So that's the vision for the TV show. What I'm not willing to compromise in the process is editorial control, ownership. And that is why we're raising the funds to just buy our own airtime, because then we don't get caught up in being owned by a corporation and being filtered and being told what we can and cannot say. It's not a cheap path to take, but I believe it will be a pathway that will create sustainability and create jobs for people and allow us to do what we do with excellence.
You kind of already answered some of the questions I was going to follow up with, but my first thought was with the really sizable audience you already have on social media. I read somewhere that you reached more than 15 million people on your social media last year. Why start a TV show, with the perception that TV is like an older media form that seems like it has a sort of a shrinking audience? Why go there? But as we were talking, I was thinking about it as a photographer, and I love doing street photography and just, doing street portraits. But if I want to do a really nice portrait of someone, it's nice to have a studio space where I can go in and really plan it and have assistants help with and all of that. So that was sort of helped me understand why you're going in this direction.
And to go even a layer deeper, no one is doing this work to be rich, right? Like nobody's getting rich doing this work that I know of, at least. But the people who have the heart to go out and do this work oftentimes are not paid. I am a mother of 3. I want to keep doing this work. How do I support my family and myself, not to have an extravagant lifestyle, but to have a decent quality of life and continue to do this work? So you can reach 15 million people in a year, but how much money are you making doing that? And are you making enough money to support yourself and those people you're responsible for? And for me, that is what every time when our community is not in a crisis and I have time to sit down and go to a whiteboard, the number one question I have asked is, how is this sustainable? How do I sustain this work for a year? How do I sustain this work for 5 years? How do I sustain this work for 10 years? And so every time I think I figured out a way to sustain it on social media independently, the algorithms change, or the way in which their ads run change, or we're in a recession and prices go up, and so I have to consistently be creative and innovative in the way in which I think about staying authentic to who I am and what my values are and what my promise and commitment to community is, while also still trying to figure out how to sustain this work. And I think that launching a TV show creates new ways for sustainability in a long term, not just for myself, but for a team of people. It increases the quality of our production, and it doubles down for what we can share on social media. We're not producing a show that's going to air exclusively on TV. We likely won't publish the whole show on social because not a lot of people are watching 30 minutes of programming on social, but you'll see those same 3-minute clips that you see on social media. You'll still see that on social and now on air. So I think, when you think about the business of media, it's not something that we talk a lot about in community space or movement space, but it is something that if you're going to do this work for 10 and 15 and 20 years, you absolutely have to think about. And so for me, coming from TV and understanding that side of business, I think that there is a way to sustain the work that I'm doing through launching a TV show.
So it's interesting. Like, I think probably most people don't even know that you could do that, right? That you could just purchase a half hour or an hour of airtime and air whatever you want on those mainstream channels. I remember way back, maybe it was Lyndon LaRouche, one of the sort of out there presidential candidates, doing something like that and just buying like an hour of airtime and go and talking for an hour and saying all kinds of stuff. But it's not something that I think happens a lot, right? Because obviously most people don't have that kind of money. But is there still a danger though that, like, whether it's because those stations are still ultimately owned by whether it's Hubbard Broadcasting or whoever, that there could still be censorship or you could get kicked off if they don't like what you're putting on the air?
Well, I think there's a big difference between Hubbard and Sinclair. And I have had several meetings with the general manager at CW who has given us a commitment that there will not be censorship. At the end of the day, we're spending our money with them, so we are their client. And if you know me and you've been following me, you should know that I'm a person of principle and of integrity. And if I encounter any of that, the people will know.
Yeah.
And we'll be asking for a refund for our money. And so that's just the bottom line. It's like if there is censorship, that is not a place where we can afford to make compromises in the work that we're doing. So if there's censorship, we'll just pull our show.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. And I think when that comes to be, it'll be an eye-opening for a lot of people that exists as an option. It takes a lot of work and you've had to put a lot of energy into the fundraising and building a team and all of that, but it's inspiring that it can be done. One other thing I wanted to ask about is, in addition to the video and reporting work that you're most known for, you had your first photo exhibit last year at Indigenous Roots in St. Paul on the East Side with the theme of freedom of the press and a focus on BIPOC independent journalism. Tell us about that exhibit a little bit and about your photography. Most people probably know you more for your reporting and maybe surprised to find out that you'd had a photography exhibit.
Yeah, I had no intention to have a photography exhibit. The executive director at Indigenous Roots, Marianne, encouraged me to do the exhibit and was really supportive. A lot of people don't know that some of the times when I go out, I am also taking pictures. I developed that as a habit from when I worked in mainstream media. My first title and role at a news company was multimedia journalist, which I tell
Okay.
people is just a really fancy word for a reporter with her own camera. And when we went out, we had to film, we had to photograph, we had to write, we had to edit, we had to do everything. And while I felt so bogged down in the moment of having to do all of those things, that experience is what gave me the confidence to step out on my own. Because I reflected back, I was like, hold up. I used to go out here every day. At 9 a.m., I'd start the day. And by 5 p.m., I had a story every single day. I know I can do this independently. And we had times where our editors or the web manager would text us and say, hey, we heard you're on the scene of breaking news. Send us a picture. And you just got in the habit. Or even when you think about publishing to social media, you have to create a thumbnail for YouTube. You have to create a thumbnail for Facebook and Instagram. So what is that picture? What is that still image? Sure, you can take a frame from the video, but it's not going to have the same clarity or impact as taking a still image that you photographed. And so I have always, for the most part, taken photos while I'm on the scene, if I'm able to, and have the bandwidth to think in that capacity. I never did it with the intent of doing an exhibit. I did it with the intent of capturing and documenting what was happening and having a decent thumbnail or a header image for my article that I was writing. But as a result of my discipline, I did end up with a lot of historic photos that definitely could and end up being used in an exhibit that traveled the state. And so Yeah, I mean, it was definitely not something I intended to do, but I'm very glad that I did it because we got to take the exhibit to different communities, different organizations like Urban Ventures and Indigenous Roots, and also to different colleges, and to speak to broader audiences about what was happening and to keep the conversation going and to be able to amplify stories like that of Kelvin Horton, who, yeah, we published that online and got thousands of views. But if you ask people who Kelvin Horton is, most people don't know.
Still to
So
this day, yeah.
yeah, and so for me, it was like, wow, this is another way to further amplify stories. And there's also something really powerful about having something you can hold, something tangible that you can give to people, that they can put on their coffee table, that other people will look at, and that will have a life of its own outside of just Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So I think people should be open, to exploring new ways to do what they do, and there's not always one path to your goal or your mission. And so for me, changing the narrative is not, I mean, there's more changing the narrative, there's more than one way to do that, and it was really powerful for me to be able to do that through Freedom of the Press photo exhibit last year.
Yeah, that's so cool. And that sort of brings me to a question about what some of the work you've done or some of the things you've covered over the past 2+ years since the George Floyd uprising, and even going back further if you'd like, that really stand out to you as the most memorable or impactful that you're proud of.
I think a lot about Delshia Perry and what happened to her son. When we first met her, she told us what happened to her son and asked that we follow up with her and keep in touch with her. And when I say we, I'm talking about Nico of Unicorn Riot and myself. And so we followed up with her. We did a second interview and we developed a relationship with her. She trusted us with footage of her son dying inside Beltrami County Jail. She had already given the footage to Fox 9, and we were not, at first, we were not sure when they were going to, or if they were going to air their story. So we began going through hours and hours of footage, and it was devastating. It was heartbreaking. It was traumatizing. It was, I mean, I still have those images ingrained in my mind because I spent several days, at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning trying to edit this footage down into a way that would be impactful and make a difference for this family. A few days into the editing, I started to see these teasers on Fox 9. And, it was Delshia's story. It was the story of her son, Hardell, dying in Beltrami County Jail. And so they said, airing this Thursday at 10 p.m. I worked in mainstream media. I know what those teasers are. Those teasers are for a period of time that's called sweeps. And sweeps are, I'd say they happen quarterly at every TV station. That is when you air your juiciest stories. That is when you get the chance to go a little bit deeper than your daily reports, all with the intention of driving ratings. And it broke my heart to see a story that was so inhumane, cruel, and this just gross injustice being used in such a sensational way to drive ratings. And so Nico and I shared this with Nico. I don't think he was aware of the, the workings of mainstream media and whatnot. And so we made a goal, like we were going to get the story out first.
Okay.
And we did, and it got millions of views. And you fast forward, and what is the impact that storytelling can have? Well, the law changed. The medical professional, the doctor who oversaw the contract at that hospital, lost his license. And to me, that is we're not activists, but there is a power in telling a story that can lead to tangible change. When you expose the truth, when you expose injustices, it will compel people to take action. It will move people's hearts and minds to a space where they say, what can I do? And so that is the power of journalism. And so I think a lot about that story when I get tired and I just am wondering, why am I still doing this? And is it making a difference? I think about that. And you're not going to have that type of impact with every single story you do, right? But for a body of work, a portfolio of work, if you're continuing to amplify stories, you eventually you do get those kinds of results where it does lead to tangible change.
And that seems like a good lead into me to another thing I wanted to touch on. You mainly report in the Twin Cities, but I know you have traveled to other places as well. You've done, I believe, some reporting from Washington, D.C. And very recently, I think you were in Jackson, Mississippi, reporting on the failure of the water system there, leaving the large number of the residents of the capital city of the state of Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, which is an 80% Black city, without water, period. So why did you decide to go to Jackson? And can you tell us a little bit about what you saw there?
I decided to go to Jackson because I felt compelled that there was a gross injustice that was happening. And the coverage that I was seeing of it did not feel reflective of the magnitude of what was happening. And I did get a call from Wayfinder Foundation that, they would support with resources and us going there. That was also another reason why I went, was because we had resources from this organization to be able to go. When I got to Jackson, I realized that not only was the magnitude of what was happening not being portrayed accurately, but the history of what had led to where we are today was not being portrayed accurately. The Mississippi Department of Health fined the city of Jackson in 2010 for poor water quality. That's 12 years ago. How has this been happening for 12 years? In 2012, 2 years later, the federal government, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, fined the city of Jackson almost $500,000 for poor water quality. That was 10 years ago. So the federal government has known about water issues in Jackson for 10 years. Yet and still, when I turn on the TV, the information I'm getting from mainstream media predominantly is that there was a flood at the end of August that resulted in water issues. That's a very big difference in terms of story. Oh, well, these people have been dealing with bad water issues for a few weeks. No, they've been dealing with it for more than 10 years, and the federal government knows. The governor held a press conference that I was able to attend, and I asked him about the long-term plan. The short-term plan is obviously to get water restored, to improve water quality so that it's drinkable. But what's the long-term plan? When you're talking about a city that has failing infrastructure for more than 10 years, this is not even getting into the class action lawsuit that was filed earlier this year stating that dozens, if not hundreds of children have tested positive for lead in the city of Jackson. And that in 2015 through 2018, and this is on the city's website, at the very top, there's a link to a PDF that says in 2015 to 2018, they found lead in the water, in the city's water. So it's not just about the failing water plant. It's also about the pipes under the ground that contain lead that were installed in 1920 and need to be replaced. But that is going to cost millions. And so I feel really passionate about it because of what I learned while I was there. And as a journalist and wanting to just speak to the facts and not like just the emotion on the heart of the story, but to speak to the facts. And these are the facts that the federal government has known since 2012. What have they done?
Well, and the other thing that in the way that it's reported, I think in mainstream media is it's basically blame the victim. Jackson, Mississippi, a lot of people may not know, has one of the most progressive mayors in the country who comes out of a long tradition in the Black liberation movement. And there's a strong movement there as well, that is rooted in going all the way back to Reconstruction, honestly, building Black political power. And they are punished for that by the state government, which is overwhelmingly white and extremely conservative. And so they are, in my opinion, intentionally starved of resources to do things like keep up the infrastructure so people can live. So you end up with the media making it sort of blaming the victim. Oh, this, that narrative of like Black people get in power and they mess everything up. They don't know what they're doing. We need white people to, get back in power again. That kind of old racist stuff that's not so old. When in fact, it's cities do not have the resources to maintain and rebuild water supplies from the 1920s in a whole major city. It needs the state and federal government.
Especially in a city where there has been strategic divestment.
Exactly.
So when you look at the demographics of Jackson in the 90s, they're very different than what the demographics are today. They call it white flight. So strategically, the white folks in the city have moved to surrounding suburbs, taking their tax dollars with them, shrinking the tax base in the city of Jackson. So how can the city repair the infrastructure or replace the infrastructure when it no longer has a tax base? Because a lot of the white folks who were pissed off about integration decided that they wanted to move. There has been a domino effect that has led to where that city is today. And in my opinion, if there isn't some kind of federal intervention, I think that they're on the brink of economic collapse. I mean, it does not feel hopeful to interview the mayor. And, I asked him about, there's several pending litigations that the governor is either involved with or associated with. One of them being litigation for the airport in the city of Jackson. The municipality, the city of Jackson, owns the airport, right, but the state has been vying for control of it, and they're currently involved in a lawsuit right now for it. The performance, from my understanding of the airport, has increased, and it could be a way for the city to have economic independence in the future, right? But if you take that away, how is the city ever going to be able to have economic independence? And I asked the mayor about it directly. His response was that when he went to the governor, the governor's office to talk about what the city need, he asked for funding for the water plant, for the infrastructure, and everybody in his administration was kicked out the room. And the lieutenant governor told him that they will not talk about funding for things like the water plant until he gives up the airport.
Right. And that's exactly what happens in these kinds of crisis situations. We saw it with Hurricane Katrina. We saw it with the hurricane in Puerto Rico. They use any crisis as an excuse to push a privatization agenda, a defunding agenda for.
Yeah, they're talking about that with the water plant,
Exactly.
privatizing the ownership of the water plant. And at the end of the day, those residents deserve to have clean water. And if the water plant needs to be privatized in order for that to happen, then that's one thing. But what does ownership of the airport have to do with citizens being able to access clean water, Americans being able to access clean water?
Exactly. Well, we're creeping up on an hour here, so I want to start wrapping towards the end with a couple of final questions. And one was, this is a podcast that's mainly about photography and sort of the politics of photography and videography. So, when did you first pick up a camera or a video camera? Tell us a little bit about how you got interested in photography and videography.
I picked up my first camera when I worked in radio, and I was really young. I was in my early 20s, extremely passionate about telling stories. At that time, I was doing a lot of celebrity interviews, and they were only really, being broadcast over the radio. And I just felt like there was so much that people were missing of the experience that I was having with doing these interviews, that I wanted to figure out a way to be able to film them and share them on social media. And this was like at the very beginning of like Facebook being a thing. And so I would film them or try to find somebody I went to school with to help film them. And boy, we made so many mistakes. Poor audio, poor lighting, just every amateur mistake you can make, we made it. But eventually, the repetition of doing that, I started to develop the skill set of, being able to film and edit. And when I moved to Columbus, Georgia, that skill set afforded me the opportunity to work part-time at a public access TV station. And so a lot of people in Columbus, Georgia knew me as a radio personality on their hip hop station, but I was a single mom. And so after I got off the air, I went to my part-time job at this public access TV station. There was nothing glamorous about filming the city council meetings or the school board meetings. But again, the repetition of working with cameras and filming and editing ultimately is what allowed me to transition into news and equipped me with the skill set and the experience that I still use to this day, right? So yeah, I started in my early 20s, self-taught for the most part. And yeah, I think I became a really good editor because I made so many mistakes when I was filming that I had to learn how to fix it quickly in post.
Learn everything through trial and error, I guess, unfortunately. So what kind of, a lot of people really get into camera gear, and what kind of gear do you use? So I'll ask that. We don't want to disappoint those people. So what kind of like video camera do you use? What kind of lens or lenses do you use? And when you do photography, what do you use?
I am using a C100 right now because of the flexibility it gives me when I live stream. And what I mean by that is it's a pretty portable camera. It's not as big as like a FS7 or a FS9, but I still have the XLR inputs. And it's one of very few cameras that you can actually record while you're streaming. By the way, if anybody else out there knows of cameras that can do both at the same time, please send me links to those cameras. But yeah, and it maintains battery life for longer than some of the other DSLRs. So I started with two Canon EOS RPs, but the battery life, the inability to record while live streaming just made them not really good options. I'll use those sometimes for like sit down interviews or backups. When I'm photographing, I have a Sony S7 III. No, a Sony, not without the S. So A7 III, Sony A7 III. And really love the colors and the auto. It has really, really good autofocus.
Yeah, that's what I use too. Same
Yeah,
camera. It's great.
When you're kind of jumping out and don't have a ton of time, I think the auto settings on there are really, really great. And then I have a camcorder that I don't really use much anymore, but I started with that when I first started doing live streaming because of the battery power. But kind of moved away from it because it didn't have the versatility to record while filming. And yeah, I think that's it. I like to travel lightly. So while I really do like the FS7, FS9, like that series, it just doesn't feel functional for me because a lot of my shooting is in the field, fast paced, you have to be mobile. So I've adjusted my setup quite a bit over the years because I always want the flexibility to be able to move quick.
Yeah, I think maybe a lot of people don't think about when you're, for example, covering a protest that is marching, whether it's for a block or a mile, and if you have a photography camera, that's heavy enough. But if you're carrying video equipment, my God, you can really do some damage to your body if you keep doing that for years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then we have our live stream box, and we originally had a LiveView Solo, and now we have the LU300, and that's a couple extra pounds. If you have a tripod, if you have a good tripod, that's really heavy. Then the camera equipment and extra batteries, a microphone. Then if you have lights, it's a lot. And I remember even, you say a block or a mile, but I still would like to know how many miles we traveled after Daunte Wright was killed, because we were live from the intersection all the way to the police department, which I believe was well over a mile that we traveled with all of that equipment live.
Yeah, that's not close. Yeah, for sure. So is there anything else that you'd like to touch on that we didn't get a chance to talk about yet?
No, I think we covered it all. Brad, this was amazing. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I guess, if anything, just encourage people to follow the journey, to support the TV show. I think it's going to be really, really exciting to take our voices, community voices, and amplify them on a new platform. And so you can find information about that along with links to all of my work on my website, georgiafort.com.
Thanks so much.
A rich man's world. I have turned the soul of this beautiful land, but that beauty a rich man's world. I have turned the soul of this beautiful land, but
You can support Red Lens Podcast by supporting my Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Siegel Photos, SIGALPHOTOS, and sign up for a small monthly donation. That will go a long way in helping sustain the podcast and my work as a political photographer. Thank you for checking out and supporting Red Lens Podcast.